Welcome back to True Law Stories. I'm Garlic here, and today we're going to talk about some crazy employment law stories. One about a drug whistleblower, which is amazing, and one about a police chief that was flashing more than his badge. A good friend and amazing employment law attorney, amazing entrepreneur, Bertha Burruezo. Thank you so much for being on the show. Awesome. I'm excited to talk to you about this. Of course, it's brought to you by videocasestory.com. One of the best ways to grow your business or your law firm is through your client stories, capturing them on video. It's super simple at videocasestory.com, and we'll give you 50 different ways that you can use those to grow your business. All right, Bertha. So, we're going to talk about a whistleblower case with the drug whistleblower and, the police chief case. But before we get started, let's just talk a little bit about because you've got an interesting story about how you got into employment law. So how did you get into employment law?
Really by happenstance. My first, honestly, as a law student, you kind of take the first thing you get. And so I was in the insurance defense world for about a year and a half, and it just wasn't bringing professional satisfaction. So I started looking around, and there was an employment law firm, a boutique firm where that's all they did, that was hiring. And so I applied, and I fell in love with the profession. It's a very interesting area of law. There's no two cases that are alike, and there's always people doing unpredictable things. So I've been doing employment now for about 19 years.
We're a few years into the pandemic now. How has employment law changed over stay at home and all that? It's been pretty crazy, I'm sure.
Our area, and the reason why it's so interesting to me, is that our law changes with what's going on with society. And so naturally, when COVID hit, the rules that employers played by just changed dramatically overnight. And so you went from managing people in your office to managing people remotely, which provided a ton of challenges, not to mention now we have laws that they need to abide by, and the laws were changing daily. I would have to tell my clients, hey, today's advice is this, and literally within 2 days I would have to give them a whole different set of rules to play by. So COVID has really changed the landscape for employment lawyers.
Yeah, it's crazy, and it's so important. That if you have multiple employees, to be talking to an employment law attorney, because I know so many people are just winging it, right? And some bad stuff can happen if you wing it.
Because the biggest thing that we tell our clients is consistency, and when you have N+ employees, naturally you're going to have managers, and so unless everyone is playing by the same playbook and you're getting the right advice, then people are just making decisions based on how they feel, what they think, what they believe in. There's just so many different factors that impact people's behavior. Definitely getting the right advice is crucial to staying out of trouble.
Awesome. And if someone does want to talk to you, and you work with clients, you have clients in Florida, but you work with clients all around the country, right? Because employment is usually federal.
Yeah.
Correct.
However, there are that have businesses nationally, all over the country, and so if it's advice particular to a certain state, we always get assistance. But yeah, we give day-to-day advice on making employment decisions, primarily in terms of we get calls, essentially day-to-day. Okay, this is what happened. Here's a crazy situation that happened to me, Bertha. How do I handle it? And so really, and that's a skill set that we developed over time from seeing a lot of cases come through the courts, and see how judges deal with particular decisions. So that's our forte.
Awesome. And we'll put a link to it, but burruezolaw.com. Put a link in the show notes. And that's obviously amazing. We've worked with her for years and heard a lot of their stories, and so is her husband, Carlos. They're well recognized. They're fantastic people. So if you are looking for advice, especially if you have a startup, Bertha really does a lot with that. But you talked about crazy stories that you hear all the time, and we have a couple of them I'd love, you're going to share today. But the first one, before we get into the crazy police officer, the sheriff, let's talk about whistleblower law first before we get into this specific story. How does whistleblower law work? in the U.S.?
Well, they're different depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, but essentially whistleblower law is it's when an employee sees that a company is breaking a particular law, and whistleblower is someone who either calls a government entity or even calls us or calls someone that regulates an industry to say, hey, my company, my employer that I'm working with is doing something that is illegal. What do I do? Because as an employee, you're put in a very uncomfortable situation, if you will, in the sense that, they know by speaking out, they may lose their job. So it's a very precarious situation. When we phone call, we have to be very careful how we handle it. And sometimes the employee doesn't want to be known. So that adds a different layer to it if they don't want to be known as the snitch, if you will, the person who could essentially blow up a company.
Yeah, it's crazy. And how often do these types of things happen? Do they happen more than we think?
It does happen what people think, and I think the reason why it's not as known, if you will, as of what I mentioned, in the sense that people don't want their name to be associated with the person who kind of pulled back the drapes of what was going on. But there are also laws that protect individuals, and so when someone becomes a whistleblower, many times their identity is hidden, if you will, or protected. And so because of that reason, these types of cases aren't really that mainstream. I mean, there are some that we'll hear on the headlines, about a CIA agent who was, out, or, those very high level situations. But, for these case of private companies, most times you just won't hear about it.
Interesting. I can't imagine the level of stress. And so you had one pharmaceutical company. Can you tell us a little bit about this? The person that came to you?
Yeah, it was a very case, as they all are, but this one really captured our attention from the moment this client came in, because she worked for a very well-known pharmaceutical company. It's a company based in, they have been so that the name is known industries that they're in. It's just not in the pharmaceutical company. So of course, when she came in, and we asked her, one of the first questions that we ask all of our potential clients is, who's your employer? So anyway, when she told us the name, of course, our ears perked up, because typically in these organizations, the bigger ones, they're buttoned up pretty tightly. They have lawyers on staff. They have people who have been in the industry and that help them maintain compliance across the board. So it's very I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. It's unusual when someone comes in. It's a company that typically we would have thought does the right thing, if you will.
Gotcha. And before you take that type of case, I mean, you obviously can't just take that person's word on it, can you?
And that's where things start to get sticky, because it's employment handbook, which most companies have. There's usually language in there that says, you can't take any of our documents. There's confidentiality, and so we have a client that comes in that claims or makes allegations that their employer is doing wrongdoing. The first thing we ask for is proof, and sometimes that proof requires an employee to obtain information that they're not otherwise entitled to. And so, unfortunately, the rubber meets the road, in the sense that, we tell our clients, this could get very uncomfortable for you. And if you're not comfortable providing the proof, then perhaps you're not in the right space right now to talk about what's going on.
And obviously there's laws to protect the whistleblower and obviously the attorney, but how do you feel when this is happening? Because this becomes this is in the middle of a tense situation, and not that all law isn't, but this is like detective/tense work. How are you feeling when something like this comes through?
I always get nervous, because the one thing that I've learned being an employment lawyer is that your job is a huge component of what you do. I mean, you work 8 hours a day. That's a big chunk of your time, and so knowing that we are potentially going to put this person who spends 8 hours of their day under more stress of being sort of a, I don't want to make it sound, more salacious, I guess, if you will, but this person becomes almost like a clandestine operator within, they're like a spy. And so I know that added layer of basically telling them, okay, you have to go into work and pretend that you're okay, that there's no issues, is a big ask. And so I know that from personally, not only professionally, that putting somebody in that situation sometimes doesn't end well for anybody.
How did this all unfold then? Go to courts? What
Yeah,
happened?
well, essentially, we gave her the instructions in terms of, okay, this is how a whistleblower case works from beginning to end, and she saw the end game, which was eventually she would have to testify against her employer, and so we gave her the best case and the worst case scenario. We never know how an employer is going to react when we confront them with, news that they may be breaking the law, and so with her, we gave her the option and said, you can do this one of two ways. We can go informally to your employer and, talk to them and say, hey, this is the evidence we have, or we can go straight to court, file a lawsuit, and it's all out in the open. And so with her, she made the decision to not do this publicly. She wanted us to handle it in a very quiet way, if you will, because she knew that the allegations were heavy, and that her employer, had a lot of muscle behind them that could potentially stop her career. It could end her career as a scientist. So anyway, we went to the employer and we said to them, hey, we have a client. She's a scientist. She works in this department. She handles these particular research tests, and this is what she's telling us. She's saying to us that this drug that you are about to release into the market has caused deaths, and we have the paperwork that proves that there are individuals dying from this test, that this new product, if you will, that you're rolling out. And so most employers that we go to with a sort of like an informal discussion don't even entertain our phone calls. They don't want to hear anything unless there's a lawsuit. But this was different. As soon as we told them who our client was and, the evidence that we had, they came to the table, if you will, immediately. And so they said, whoa. Those are some heavy allegations that you're making. We're not going to confirm or deny that that's the truth. But how do we resolve this quietly? So both sides wanted to do it quietly, which worked out well.
Oof, that's because that's like, that's what movies are made out of, right? And like the company goes and takes care of the scientist.
Yeah, it is. You say it's what happens in movies, but I have to believe now that these people who make movies are basing it from real situations, because we've seen it. And she was she never said to us her life was in danger, but when you're dealing with a company that big, where that much is on the line, that could be a possibility.
No, people have definitely disappeared for less, right?
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, oh man, that's scary. I'm glad it ended up for the best. Now, did the scientist retain, like, did she stay there or did she leave?
Yeah, she left. She couldn't. What she was doing was conflicted. She was conflicted because as a scientist, she knew that what she was doing was not in alignment with who she was. She was with the company for about 4 years, and so I think that for her was long enough to know that wasn't the place for her. But, she was happy to leave and vice versa. I think the company was happy to get her out of there. And so she walked away still conflicted, because we are not sure if their changes were made, and that's the part that we never hear about, is when these cases resolve themselves quietly, you never know what the employer is going to do, because there was no court decision. There was no regulator or no one saying, hey, you need to make changes.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's crazy. It is, yeah. Like you always think there's like a happy ending, but you're like,
Yeah.
no pun intended. We'll put a link to Burruezo and Burruezo. To follow her on LinkedIn. Bertha puts out a YouTube show as well and a podcast, and has a lot of amazing information. And you work with both employees and employers. I know we talked about the employee representation, but you also work on the employer side, and employers need that as well, don't they?
Yeah, and that's the beauty of our practice, is that we've seen both sides, and we know that we understand the psychology behind both sides. And so we were naturally trained, not naturally, but we were trained as defense lawyers representing companies, and so that's something that we're very familiar with. But getting sort of that insight into where an employee is coming from has really benefited both of our clients, both sides of the client table, if you will.
Sure, for sure. I mean, you need to know both sides, and if you're an employer, there's a lot of employees that I'm sure there's a lot of employees that come to you with not fake cases, but also kind of cases that it's really their fault, right? And the employers need to protect themselves.
Exactly, yeah. And if an employer is doing the right thing, in the sense that they're making an effort to follow the laws, and there's a lot, so it's hard to do. But if there's an employer that's really making an attempt to do the right thing, then for us that's what we want to do, is to help them to defend themselves in those situations, because they didn't do anything wrong per se. They just had a bad decision maker or something. Who knows? It's lots of different variables, but yeah.
I mean, this has been fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us on True Law Stories. Thanks for sharing those stories.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on True Law Stories. This has been Ian Garlic and Bertha Burruezo. Make sure to check out and follow her. And if you connect with her on LinkedIn, tell her you saw her here. All right. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.